what have they done to our food? So I'm going to actually tell you about the title of this seminar at the very end. So I'm going to build suspense, and then it will be very disappointing to you all. But that's how life works sometimes. So for those of you in the audience, we're actually streaming this live online, so that's what the webinar rules thing. You people that are watching online, be kind to each other. They can actually chat. We're not going to be able to see it here in the room, but they're going to be able to chat with each other if they like, I believe. So I want to jump in and kind of give you a little bit about my credentials, my biases. Because I think that's one of the very most important things to evaluate anytime you're listening to anybody talk is what their credentials are, what their biases are. And you know, we like to think of ourselves, particularly in academia, as being unbiased sources of information. And we can strive to that, but you know what? We all have biases as well. I'm biased, you're biased. Everyone has different biases. The key is not letting those biases become problematic when we're making decisions. Or if we do allow them to be, you know, influence that decision, then, you know, at least using data as much as possible. So one of my credentials to talk about food and biases when talking about food is almost every day of my life that I can remember, I have eaten food. And I say that tongue-in-cheek, but you know what? That's one of the things that unites us all. That's common ground that no matter where we fall on the side of the debate about anything food-related, we all eat food. And so we're starting from the same point. And I think that's really important to remember, that there is always common ground because we all have to eat food. Another bias I've got that has become very important to me lately is I'm in charge of feeding this guy at least part of the time. So the last year and a half, I've taken a very different perspective on foods that I buy. You know, I'm much more interested in food safety and nutrition and buying healthy, good food, and also affordable, because he doesn't look like much, but this kid eats a lot. I've also found a renewed interest in a lot of foods that I'd kind of forgotten about for a very long period of time. Things like Cheerios and bananas are mainstays in my house, and I've eaten more Cheerios and bananas in the last 6 months than I probably did in the previous 15 years, because they're always available, because that's what he likes. I also grew up growing food. So this is actually a picture of my dad and my grandpa. I don't want to brag or anything, but my dad was a pretty big deal. He won the state 4-H Sugarbeet project when he was a youngster. That's him on the left and my grandpa on the right. So I grew up on a farm, and that does bias my opinions. And I will flat out tell you that I am a big, firm believer in family farms, keeping family farms strong, because my dad is a family farmer. And so I want family farms to have the tools, the technologies, the resources available to them to keep family farms strong. That's one of the things that biases a lot of my opinions. I'm a very strong believer in doing what it takes to help farmers like my dad be successful and stay on the land. And that influences what I do now as a researcher. So my current job is mostly research, a little bit of teaching, and sometimes I give seminars like this around the state and region. But my primary research is actually conducting research on weed management in crops. So the crops I work with are things like wheat, dried beans, sugar beet, sunflower, corn, barley. The picture there is me outstanding in my field. I actually really like this picture. Primarily, Steve Miller took this one of me. I primarily like it because you can see the dry bean crop, you can see the weeds growing a little bit taller than the crop, and then you see me a little bit taller than the weeds. I like to think of this as me being kind of like king of the weeds, even though they pretty much beat me every time when it comes to real battles. So that's kind of who I am and how I see the world. So my job, again, is to help family farmers produce food. That's how I see my role. And so it's frustrating to me sometimes when I hear some of these misconceptions about agricultural practices, about what farmers do. And one of the things that really frustrates me probably more than anything is when I hear claims that are something along the lines of, you know, growers are only using this seed or this pesticide or this tool or this technology because they've been duped by big ag. You know, the big seed companies have forced them to make these decisions. Because what's that saying to me is that my dad is stupid. And he's been fooled by these big ag conglomerates. And, You know, no one wants to think that their family is stupid, right? And I don't think it's the case. I think farmers that are still farming today are pretty smart business people. You know, if they weren't smart business people, if they weren't doing what's good for the land, what's good for their business as a farmer, they probably wouldn't be farming long. Now, does that mean agriculture is perfect? Absolutely not. There's a lot of problems with current agricultural production practices. That's one of the things we do in the College of Ag, is try to make that better. There's always room for improvement. We're trying to reduce synthetic pesticide use. We're trying to reduce fertilizer use. We're trying to make plants more water use efficient. We're always trying to improve. Agriculture as it exists today is far from perfect, and we need to improve upon that. But that also doesn't mean that a lot of growers aren't trying to do the best they can from both an economic and environmental perspective. So those are the types of misconceptions that really, I think, frustrate me the most. But there are a lot of them out there. And I'm going to touch on a few of them. You certainly don't have time in a 50-minute time period to go through all of them that exist. But one of the things that I want to draw your attention to is we who are working in agriculture in some form or another like to blame others for these misconceptions that exist. You know, these organizations and individuals that are spreading fear and disinformation about how farmers grow food. One of the more common ones, how many of you have seen an image that looks like this, with some sort of a fruit or a vegetable with a syringe sticking into it? Almost always related to something related to GMOs, genetically modified organisms, or biotech crops. Regardless of what you call them, this image shows up a lot. And I can tell you, if you see this image on a website or in an article or anywhere, you can basically forget about anything that's said in that article. Because there's only two reasons why someone would put a picture like this on an article about GMOs. One, they're trying to scare you. If they're trying to scare you, they're probably not a very credible source of information. They're not there to inform. They're there to scare you. The second possible reason why they might have an image like this is because they actually think that's how GMOs are made. For either one of those reasons, they're probably not a credible source, because this is not actually how GMOs are made. We don't stick a syringe in a fruit and have a GMO. And I know this because I've tried it. I put a syringe full of a colored liquid into a banana, and it didn't actually turn into a GMO. And of course you're saying, don't be stupid, Andrew. Of course that's not going to work. You used the wrong colored liquid. But no, I thought about that. I tried red, I tried blue, and I tried green. In no case did I end up with a GMO banana. What I ended up with was a weird discolored banana. Luckily for me, it still tasted okay. Okay, so the misconceptions are plentiful. We like to blame others for this misconception. But I would argue that, you know, for all of my colleagues in the university system, we are partially to blame. I think we've not been doing a good enough job getting good information out there. If you do a Google search for the terms either GMO or pesticide, if you look at the search results that show up on those first two pages, most of the search results, over half for both search terms, are organizations ideologically opposed to use of GMOs or pesticides. Guess how many university extension or research sites show up when you search for those? In the top 2 pages of results for those 2 search terms in particular, none. In fact, Natural News came up before any university site for both of those search terms. So that's problematic, and those of us in the university system, I think, need to do better. Part of the reason that information isn't getting out there from the university is what I'm going to call the incorrect information asymmetry. Okay, this is, I think, attributed to Alberto Brandolini on Twitter. The amount of energy needed to refute incorrect information is an order of magnitude greater than that to produce it. And this was said in jest, but there's actually a lot of truth to it. This is kind of my version of the incorrect information asymmetry. You know, when you hear someone say something, it seems plausible. Yeah, well, you're probably not going to spend a whole lot of time investigating that claim. You think, wait a minute, is that right? You know, think about when your friends say something at dinner party and you don't really believe it. What's the first thing you do? You go on Google on your phone and check it out. What is that right? Then you get to, well, that can't be right. You know, and as that claim gets more and more kind of departs from what you believe, the more energy it's going to take you to try and figure out whether it's true or not. And this is just kind of my personal curve here, that dotted line. The probability that I'm going to respond with a blog post or an extension bulletin or with a phone call or something, if it seems realistic and plausible to me, I'm probably not going to spend any time worrying about it. The further over to the right it gets, the more likely I am to try and correct that information, or at least find out if it's true. But at some point, you get to that kind of diminishing returns. I simply don't have unlimited amounts of time. I wish I did, but I don't. And so at some point, it's just going to take too much time for me to actually get to the bottom of this. It's too far out of my area of expertise. It's not something that I can invest the time in doing. So that's, I think, one of the reasons why university information isn't. Because when we say something, it's really important that we get it right. Because we are a trusted source of information in a lot of cases. And so that's really important. But another really important part of this curve that I think I want to spend a little bit of time on is that far left, that seems plausible. That is almost as problematic as the ones on the other side. When you hear something that you think sounds right, it fits within your worldview, how likely are you to do some background checking on whether it's true or not? You're almost certainly not. We like information that fits with our current biases, with our current worldview. But it's equally important that we spend time double-checking that information as well, especially those of us who are giving extension talks, those of us teaching. That's a really important thing, too, because otherwise we're just basically parroting the same things that we're criticizing other people for doing the same thing just because it fits with our biases. So it's really important on both ends of that spectrum that we spend the time required to make sure our facts are right. And so as I kind of thought about this, evaluating information, how do I do it? And I kind of have this four-step process. I don't do this cognitively. I don't really think about this. This is kind of a subconscious thing, but I've come up with 4 steps that I think I usually do when I hear something. And the step one is, what is the claim? What are people saying? And does that seem plausible given what I know about the world? Does that fit my worldview? And in a lot of cases, if what I've heard does fit my worldview, then I'm good. I'm not actually going to proceed to step 2. And I'm going to argue that that's actually just as dangerous as if you do find out something that isn't true later on. And I'm going to give you an example of one that I hear a lot. And it relates to, is glyphosate better or worse than the herbicides it replaces? I bet even people who don't know much about herbicides, don't know much about pesticides, but have read news articles about glyphosate and Roundup Ready crops, probably have an opinion on this, about whether glyphosate is better or worse than the herbicides it replaces. And I had an opinion on this too, for a long time. But it turns out the answer is yes. Glyphosate is better and worse than the herbicide it replaces. It depends on the context. This is a really big question. It's only a few words, but it takes a lot of work to answer that question. I had a student, Carl, sitting right here in the middle of the room, that actually spent a lot of time trying to answer this question with a very specific set of goals, trying to figure out, is glyphosate better or worse than the herbicides it replaces in Roundup Ready Sugarbeet compared to conventional Sugarbeet? And even if you take a very specific set of herbicides where you're just comparing Sugarbeet herbicides between the two systems, even then, it's a really complex question. The way you interpret this graph is any of those dots on the left side of that dotted line, that means the conventional herbicides are better. Anything to the right of that dotted line means glyphosate was better. That's really all you need to know to interpret these. If you look at that top half, that's glyphosate versus microrate treatments, which is the common herbicide program used in like North Dakota, Minnesota. If you look at that comparison, well, glyphosate actually might be a little bit worse compared to when you look at mammalian toxicity, honeybee toxicity, and birds. Whereas if you look at fish, groundwater, or aquatic invertebrates, glyphosate's better. Now, if you compare glyphosate to the herbicides it replaces with the herbicide programs used in Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, and Idaho, well, there, glyphosate's a little bit clearer picture that it's probably better with most of them, with the exception of mammalian toxicity, where it's about the same. So again, just even a very simple question, is glyphosate good or bad, is a really difficult one to answer. And that's the thing that I think gets lost when we're kind of arguing on GMOs, pesticides, all this stuff. Every one of these questions is really complex. It's difficult to answer. There's a lot of things that go into it. We can't boil it down to good or bad. We can't say it's evil or good. We can't say it's better or worse. Because the answer is almost always, it depends. It's an extremely unfulfilling answer no matter who's asking the question. Okay, so regardless of what the claim is, whether you believe it or not, whether it fits with your worldview or not, the next step should always be to at least go through and figure out, well, what's the support for that information? What's the data that supports that claim? What are the methods and assumptions involved? Because a lot of time, particularly people like me, will support their information with a peer-reviewed study. But even that has some flaws, and I'll talk about that a little bit later too. But beyond that, I think this is probably the most important thing we need to do when we're evaluating information, is how does that claim and the supporting data from step 2 fit within the broader body of knowledge? This is probably the most important thing, and I'm going to walk through some examples where we kind of do that, where we try to put that within the context of the broader body of knowledge, because that's really what's critical when we're evaluating anything about, scientific claims, particularly as they relate to agriculture. And then finally, my fellow scientists probably aren't going to like this one, but I think it is important. What is my stance, and is my position based on the balance of evidence or emotion? And I think that's a really important one to answer, because in some cases, we make decisions that are not supported by evidence. And you know what? That's okay. It's okay sometimes to have a position that isn't necessarily supported by data, as long as we're honest with ourselves about that. Say, I'm making this decision, but it's based on emotion. I've got this little bit of fear. I know it's irrational, but that's the decision I'm making. And that's okay. The problem is when we make decisions, we rationalize it by saying, well, the data supports this, when it doesn't. And that's when I think the friction starts, when people are trying to find data to support this emotional feeling that they have. There are times when I will just say, yeah, I realize this isn't a good decision based on the data. I like going to Vegas. I know I'm going to lose money every time I go, and I do it every time. But I'm honest with myself. I know that, well, I'm going to lose data, or I'm going to lose money. The data supports the fact that I'm going to lose money every time, but I do it anyway. So that's an emotional response. I like the high of losing that money when they take all the money off the craps table. Okay, so this third one. How does the claim supporting data fit within the broader body of knowledge? And I think this is really important, and I want to kind of explain why I think that is. So it kind of relates to that first one, confirming our biases. When we have data that supports what we think, we automatically assume it's true. And that's when it's really most important to see how that bigger body of knowledge relates. And the reason this is important is that I bet no matter what kind of harebrained idea you guys can come up with right now, I'm not actually going to ask you to do that because I don't have the time, but you guys could come up with just about any idea. I bet I could find you a peer-reviewed study that supports your idea. It doesn't matter how ridiculous it is. The Sasquatch genome has been published. Okay, you can find data in a peer-reviewed journal article that will support just about anything. So it's really critical that we figure out, okay, is that an outlier, or is that actually what most of the scientific community thinks about this topic? Okay, the other thing is factual information, when taken out of context, can be used to say just about anything. You can use it to mislead. You can use it to support your preconceived notions. That's why it's important to look at that broader body of knowledge. As my friend Paul would say, you guys know who Paul Harvey is? The younger folks probably don't really anymore. He used to do this news radio program, The Rest of the Story. So, I like to ask Paul, what is the rest of the story? So, did you know that right now in your kitchen there is a chemical that is a known mammalian mutagen, causes mutations in human cells? Did you know that you've probably put this into things you cook on a regular basis? You've probably consumed a lot of it if you like bacon. I can say without a hint of irony that sodium chloride kills. But if you look at the bigger body of knowledge, Should we ban salt? Probably not. It can be dangerous. If you pour a lot of it on soil, you're not going to get any plants there to grow for a very, very long time. If you consume enough of it, you're going to die, either from acute toxicity or from high blood pressure. But that doesn't mean it's not useful when used in an appropriate dose. So if you look at the broader body of knowledge on table salt, on sodium chloride, it's a pretty darn safe product. Okay? So, but if you just look at individual facts taken out of context, you can make anything sound pretty scary. Okay, so I'm going to kind of walk through these steps. I'm going to kind of ignore the emotional response at this point. I'll let you guys do that on your own. But I want to start off with one of the common misconceptions, that GMO food causes insert whatever disease or disorder you want to talk about there. You can look online, you can find information that says GMO causes cancer, GMO causes gluten intolerance, GMO causes obesity, GMO causes cancer. Pretty much anything you want, you can find data online, usually from less than credible sources, that GMO food is related to that particular problem. Anyone that shows this in a presentation where GMO food causes something is almost certain to show you this picture. And it's a graphic, disgusting, horrible picture, and an exceptionally misleading picture. And I saw someone give it in a presentation on Friday, and it is infuriating. This is from a study conducted by a researcher with a known anti-GMO ideology. And you can see the rat on the left there was fed GMO food. The rat in the middle was fed Roundup in its drinking water. The rat on the right was fed GMO food that had been treated with Roundup. What do you notice missing in this picture? You know, looking at the bigger body of knowledge, what's missing? Where's the control? There is no control. He had controls in the study, but it's an interesting choice not to include that in the photos, right? So what is the rest of the story? Well, it turns out there's a lot of information on rats when they're used in long-term studies. This is a study from 1973, spontaneous tumors in Sprague-Dawley rats. 45% of rats, if they're allowed to live more than 18 months, get tumors. So if you have a study that you're going longer than 18 months, so up to 2 years, and that was the 2-year study in the pictures that were shown before, at least half of them are probably going to get tumors. In this study, 81% of them spontaneously got tumors if allowed to live for 24 months. So it's a really dishonest thing to show those graphic, horrible images, but not tell you that, well, you know, just rats living for 2 years are going to get similar tumors. That's problematic. That's a really dishonest thing to do, in my opinion. So what is the rest of the story when it comes to those rats? This is actually from that same study. We present, so basically they took lots of data. This is a 2-year study. They took monthly data. They took lots of data at each time period. But even so, they only presented here one time point from that very large study, and actually a very selected bit of information from that one time point. But they say, here we present the most important findings. And so I'm going to present to you the most important findings from this study. I'm going to give you all a couple seconds here. Okay, what does this mean? This is the smoking gun right here from that study. It's okay, I couldn't figure it out either. I think Marion Nestle, who's an anti-GMO person herself, called this oddly complex. I think that's a pretty fitting way to describe it. The way the research team interpreted this is that they said profiles evidence kidney ion leakages and sex hormonal imbalance versus controls. But even though they had 10 different treatment groups evaluated over a 2-year period, they only show in this particular figure females fed 33% GMO versus the control, and they only did it for the 15-month time period. So this is a tiny little sliver of their huge data set, and this is the best smoking gun data set that they could come up with. So I actually took the data, because they released it when they published it the second time after it was retracted the first time, and actually reanalyze that. And so basically, if you look in their figure, the ion leakages they're talking about are sodium, which is, this is blood sodium, this is urine sodium, this is blood chloride, this is urine chloride. So those are the things that they think are the most relevant from this study, from this particular combination of female rats fed 33% GMO versus the controls at 15 months. So I took that same data set, and this would be the same information on blood serum sodium levels from the control and the GMO fed rats. And you can see it does look like there is indeed a difference. But oddly enough, I actually took a different treatment that they didn't show in their paper, where it's the same GMO feed, only it had been treated with Roundup. So the only difference between these two, the top and bottom left-hand panels, are that the top one does not have Roundup applied to the GMO. The bottom one did have Roundup applied. Isn't it weird that spraying Roundup on the GMO crop completely eliminated the effect that they observed? Not only that, but if you look at the right-hand panel, those are the males instead of females. The opposite trend was observed in the males versus the females. Not a lot of biological explanation for that particular change. But why didn't they present the rest of this story? And the exact same thing for serum levels. Again, a slight difference here, but it was negated in an almost identical treatment, and the exact opposite response if you looked at males versus females. Again, no real biological reason to think that's the case. This is kind of the classic definition of cherry-picking data to support a preconceived notion. They wanted to show that GMOs were bad, so they presented the data that they thought most explained or most proved that. Turns out they actually did a really bad job because that data doesn't really support what they were hoping to find. So what is the rest of the story? So there's actually been a lot of research on these very same things. This is a study that actually reviewed 1,700 different studies looking at the scientific research on GMO safety. So they concluded in their review, the scientific research conducted so far has not detected any significant hazards directly connected with the use of GE crops. Of those 1,700 studies, 312 of them evaluated GMO food and feed consumption. They found no scientific evidence of toxic allergenic effects on any GMOs currently being used. The Journal of Animal Science is another big review where they actually looked at feeding data representing over 100 billion animals since the introduction of GMO crops. They found no unfavorable or perturbed trends in livestock health and productivity over that period. I mean, if we were talking massive, half your body weight size tumors, it seems like you would find something in these 100 billion animals, and there was really no effect that they could find. Numerous experimental studies have consistently revealed the performance of health and GE-fed animals are comparable with those fed isogenic non-GE crop lines. Another study, one of the things that the authors of the rat study claim is that was the first long-term study on GMO safety. And that's an outright lie. There have actually been quite a few long-term studies on GMO safety. This study is actually a review article of those long-term studies. They examined 12 long-term studies of more than 90 days up to 2 years, which doesn't seem like a long time, but for a rat, that's actually an exceptionally long time. That's an entire lifespan for a rat. So these are relatively long-term studies for rats. They also looked at 12 different studies that looked at multi-generational effects, anywhere from 2 to 5 generations where the rats or other organisms were fed through all those generations. Results from all 24 studies do not suggest any health hazards, and in general, there were no statistically significant differences within the parameters observed. And don't take my word for it, because again, I have biases as well. You have biases, we all have biases. You can actually look at the research yourself. There's a really cool website out there developed by the group at BioFortified called GENERA, which actually is an acronym for Genetic Engineering Risk Atlas. You can actually look up all kinds of studies on GMO safety, either environmental effects, health effects, whatever you want. They've all got them there, both positive, negative. You can take a look for yourself at the primary research and see how much research has been done on this topic, because it's actually a really large body of literature. Probably one of the most studied types of organisms in the world. Okay, so Moving on beyond the rat study, another set of things that we hear a lot are, related to GMO crops and kind of then conflating the issue with some pesticides, is that GMO crops don't increase yields. Only the big seed companies benefit from this technology. The farmers planting them don't really need them. They only increase pesticide requirement and dependence, and they've made us dependent on pesticides. And so I want to kind of tell you a story about Roundup Ready Sugarbeet because it's an important crop to the state of Wyoming. And I think a lot of these things fall apart when you actually look at the experience of our growers here in the state. So one of the things, we always hear GMO crops in relation to pesticide use. And there's a reason for that. A lot of the GMOs on the market, in fact, most of the GMOs on the market, are related to pest management. We've got virus-resistant papaya, BT, corn, and cotton, herbicide-resistant corn, cotton, soybean, sugar beet, canola, and alfalfa. And there's a reason that most of the GMO traits are targeting pest management. And that's because pest management is really important. It's probably the most limiting step in a lot of crop production around the world. Actual losses around the world, anywhere from 25 to 40% of crop productivity is lost due to weeds, insects, and plant pathogenic organisms. So we talk about food waste a lot, and that's a major problem. But if you think about it, 25 to 40% of food is wasted before it's ever left the field. That's something that we need to address, and that's what conventional crop breeders are focused on. That's what GMO breeders are working on. Pest management is important. Okay, if you look at that last line, herbicide resistance for weed control, this is a technology that gets thrown under the bus a lot. Even a lot of supporters of GMOs are not big fans of Roundup Ready crops because they're seen as increasing the dependence on herbicides. And there may be a little bit of a point there, but I want to kind of take you through why herbicide resistance is so important. Weed management is also important. Of those total crop pests, about 10% of the world's crop is still lost due to weed pressure, so weed competition. So it's not surprising that a lot of our biotech traits are for herbicide resistance. Whitey Holm in 1971, a former president of the Weed Science Society of America, said this: "More energy is expended for the weeding of man's crops than for any other single human endeavor." I don't know that there's really any data to support that. But I think most weed scientists are in agreement it's a plausible idea because a lot of time is spent hand weeding crops, especially for smallholder farmers. In Ethiopia, farm families spend over 1,200 hours weeding crops. And that isn't necessarily equally distributed among those families either. Daughters spent about 35 days per year hand weeding. That's a lot of time that's devoted to hand weeding that is not devoted to other things. So weed management is a really important thing. A really good article, a profile of a sugar beet grower was in the Sugar Beet Grower magazine. I'm sure you guys all have subscribed to that too. Dwayne Grant, a sugar beet grower from Idaho. And they asked him to talk about, the transition from conventional sugar beet over to Roundup Ready sugar beet. And he had this to say about the conventional sugar beet weed control, that it was a nightmare. They had failures all the time, fields that became unharvestable due to weeds. An army of people applying herbicides around the clock. Micro rates, maxi rates, you name it. It was a horrible life. So even in a developed world, weed control is still a major pain in the butt. And this is what pre-GMO weed control looked like in sugar beet crops around the country. Up to 5 applications, usually. 3 of them very early in the crop life cycle. And these 3 applications were usually a combination of 2 to 4 different herbicides. So in Wyoming, we used mostly Betamix plus Upbeat plus Stinger 3 different times early in the growth cycle. If you didn't spray it early, the weeds wouldn't die because these are herbicides that are not all that effective. So if you get rained out of the field for 2 weeks, you might completely lose weed control. And in addition to after spending all that money and time on herbicides, it was still really common to have to send in a hand labor crew to clean up the weeds that you missed with the herbicides. If you got rained out for a week, this is what your field would look like. There are sugar beets in there, but they're completely overwhelmed with the weeds, and the herbicides we had available for weed control and conventional sugar beet would not kill these weeds. This would be a total loss. The grower would have to till this up and probably plant dry beans. So he would have lost the sugar beet crop for this year because of those conditions and because of the poor herbicides we had. Now you compare to that what growers got when they got to Roundup Ready. This is one of my field plots. You can see the border of the plot that we sprayed with Roundup. Everything around that is the weed pressure. That's not atypical for sugar beet farms in Wyoming. So a major tool. So this is what Roundup Ready sugar beet weed control looks like. 2 to 3 applications of Roundup, and you have excellent season-long weed control. Is this a perfect system? No, because now we're relying on one herbicide. Not ideal, but the nice thing about sugar beets is they're rotated on a 3 to 4 year rotation. You can't grow sugar beets in the same field back-to-back for other pest reasons. And so we already have a lot of built-in integrated weed management into this system, and so we are rotating crops, we're rotating herbicide chemistries, and things like that. Okay, the other thing about the conventional herbicides used in sugar beet is they're phytotoxic to the crop. I think it was actually Dwayne Grant that once explained to me that conventional sugar beet herbicides are a lot like chemotherapy. They hurt the beets, but they hurt the weeds a little bit more. So over time, eventually, if you spray them enough times at high enough rate, you eventually kill the weeds, but your crop looks like what we have here on the left. So this is actually near isogenic varieties, one with the Roundup Ready trait on the right, the one without the Roundup Ready trait on the left. The one on the left was treated with conventional herbicides, the one on the right was treated with Roundup. You know, if you were a farmer, that's kind of a no-brainer decision right there. Economics of this system, this is just for Wyoming. The first year it was introduced, we estimated that growers probably made an additional $200 per acre using Roundup Ready technology compared to conventional sugar beet. Some more recent research, Brian Lee and John Ritten and Chris Bastian did most of this work. As long as growers realize about a half-ton increase in sugar beet yield, they'll be more profitable even though the seed is more expensive for those Roundup Ready sugar beets. A half a ton increase is actually a fairly conservative estimate. Most of our data actually shows that it's much higher than that. And in fact, this is a plot showing sugar beet yields over time for Wyoming, Colorado, and Nebraska. The black points on the left are before Roundup Ready. This is what the yield trend has done since adoption of Roundup Ready sugar beet. Now, not all of that yield increase can be attributed to Roundup Ready sugar beet. We've gotten better genetics. We've gotten other pest management tools, some fungicides and some insecticides that also help. But I also think it's naive to think that Roundup Ready didn't contribute at least quite a bit to that when you consider the crop injury differences between the two traits. Okay, and I want to end, because this is a topic near and dear to my heart. What about the superweeds? And I will tell you right now that I hate the word superweeds. I included it here just because that's what gets the headlines. If you want to read my real thoughts about the term superweeds, you can go to our blog, which I'll put the link up at the end, and read one of my latest rants about using the word superweeds. But this is what gets shown a lot. Something similar to this, looking at glyphosate-resistant weeds over time. And I kind of separated this into before 2000 and after 2000. 2000 was the year when Roundup Ready soybean hit 50% of the soybean acres. And so if we were to expect to see a shift in resistance due to selection pressure, that's about when we would expect to see it. And that's exactly when things started changing dramatically for glyphosate-resistant weeds. Before 2000, glyphosate-resistant weeds were exceptionally rare in the U.S. In fact, we didn't have any, I think, until the first case of horseweed happened around 98 or 99. Now, after we had huge adoption of glyphosate-resistant crops, we saw a huge increase in the number of glyphosate-resistant weeds. Not surprising. You use only one herbicide, you're going to have a lot of resistance to it. But again, that's only part of the story, because we use other herbicides in agriculture, right? So if we're using lots of Roundup, that means we're not using a lot of other herbicides. And if you look at that bigger picture of herbicide-resistant weeds, if you look at ALS-inhibiting herbicides, at the same time we were increasing glyphosate-resistant weeds, we were decreasing the rate of ALS-resistant weeds. We were decreasing the rate of ACCAs-resistant weeds. We decreased the rate of photosystem II resistant weeds. We decrease the rate of synthetic auxin-resistant weeds. We decrease the rate of dinitroaniline-resistant weeds. So this is all data from weedscience.org. You can go back and check my work if you want. But if you look at the total herbicide resistance, we haven't seen this huge increase. It's basically been constant over the last 20 years. We tend to get about the same number of herbicide-resistant weeds over time. It's just that now we're finding glyphosate-resistant weeds because that's the herbicide we're using the most of, and we're decreasing the number of other herbicide-resistant weeds that we're finding. Now, that doesn't mean that that's not problematic. This is still a problematic trend. It's just not a necessarily GMO-related trend. It's a herbicide trend. We're too dependent on herbicides in general. That doesn't have anything to do with GMOs, non-GMO. That means we're too reliant on herbicides in general. And so, again, it's conflating the issues to say that, Roundup Ready has caused all these problems. Roundup Ready has caused more glyphosate resistance, but if you look at the overall trend of herbicide resistance, we've just substituted one problem for another. That's really what we've done. So in Wyoming, so this is a field from Worland, Wyoming. Chuck Duncan from Wyoming Sugar Company took this photo when I was out with him looking at a field one day. The field on the right, all those dark spots, those are herbicide-resistant weeds. That's herbicide-resistant kochia. But it's not glyphosate-resistant kochia. It's ALS-resistant kochia. One of the reasons we saw such high adoption rate of Roundup Ready Sugarbeet in Wyoming was we were already fighting one of our own superweeds. It was resistant to ALS-inhibiting herbicides because those are the only herbicides we really had available to control kochia in sugarbeet beforehand. The field over on the left is Roundup Ready Sugarbeet. So in Wyoming, where we've already got good crop rotations, we've already got fairly diverse herbicide rotations, adding that tool of Roundup Ready Sugarbeet has actually helped us manage herbicide-resistant weeds. It's been an exceptionally positive tool for those of us here in the state to manage these herbicide-resistant weed problems. Now, should we be relying less on herbicides? Again, yes, we should. But again, this technology is actually a tool that's helped us deal with the problem that we had beforehand. Okay, so that brings me to my last couple of slides. What have they done to our food? So this is what I titled it, knowing that it was a provocative title. And I'm going to admit to you that I've actually given about 6 to 8 talks over the last 10 or 12 years with this exact same title. It's been a different talk every time. But I like using this title because it's a little provocative. And I want to give you a little bit of history on that title. So it's actually, I ripped it off from CBS News, an article in 2000 that was titled, "What Have They Done to Our Food?" And the lead-in line for that article is probably every dish you've indulged in back home has been tampered with somehow by bioengineers. And even in 2000, it struck me a little odd that they would have chosen to use the word tampered. Because tampered necessarily has a connotation of something pretty negative, right? Those of you who are old enough might remember the Tylenol tampering scandal. Tampering seems pretty bad. I mean, they could have used a different word. They could have said that those plants have been altered somehow. They could have said it had been changed, modified. God forbid, they could have said improved. Because I think a lot of people would think that maybe they have been improved. Some people might disagree with that. But a lot of different words they could have used. But, I guess what I could have probably done, rather than saying what have they done with our food, I probably could have called this talk, "Food Products and Production Practices Evaluated by the USDA, FDA, and EPA have been found to be perfectly safe and been legally sold to the American public." But I feel like no one probably would have showed up for that talk. So if you have any questions or comments, I would be happy to answer them. Looks like we've got at least 5-6 minutes. I'm happy to chat, or we can all go have a beer since it's Friday if you want to. That'd be fine too.